seats. And if you're sitting behind the barriers, you've already heard me say this, but I would love it if you would come sit in the front section. And I know some people sit back there because they're afraid they might have to sneak out. You can still sneak out if you're sitting in the front section. We won't think anything different. We won't think bad. We want you to come sit in the front section of the sanctuary. So just as everyone gets their seats, we'll get started in a second. Good evening, everyone. So wonderful to see everyone here in person. As we were talking earlier, everything is so much better in person, and it just really feels that way tonight. So welcome. So my name is Rabbi Marla Hornsten, and on behalf of Temple Israel, it is truly a pleasure for me to welcome you all here. First and foremost, I would like to thank the Shalom Hartman Institute for bringing our speaker, Yossi Klein Halevi, to Detroit and to Temple Israel tonight. This is such a thrill. Several years before COVID, I was lucky enough to meet Yossi with a group of rabbis in Jerusalem. And for some reason, I remember that it was our first night of the trip. And we talked over dinner about his then new book, Letters to My Palestinian Neighbor, and this is a proof copy of the book. So that just tells you how far it goes back, which is not that many years, actually. It was a great conversation that night, so much so that none of us had trouble staying awake, which is pretty unusual for the first night of the trip, and so I expect the same tonight. As you already know, Yossi is an exceptional scholar, and I hope that you will enjoy this evening as much as I know I will. When you came into the sanctuary, you received an index card and a pencil, and this is for the Q&A, so we hope that you will use it to write down your questions during the program, and then we will collect them as Yossi concludes his remarks. I also want to thank our TI4Israel committee, sponsored by the Miriam and Isaac Bar Israel Education Fund, who has been working hard over the last year or so on Israel-based learning and programming. And we have a program for young adults coming up, you'll see here up on the screen, on Sunday, December 4th at 2 o'clock in the afternoon at Otis Supply in Ferndale, called Zionism, Anti-Semitism, and Progressive Politics. It includes lunch, and it will be a panel discussion with Shia Lerner, Director of Israel Affairs, and Associate Director of Middle Eastern Affairs at ADL as a guest panelist. He will be joined by Emma Trevax from the ADL board and Rabbi Jeff Stamba of the Well. And so if you know any young adults, or if you are a young adult, please come and pass the word about this program. So I've already talked long enough. I am thrilled to welcome you here tonight, and I look forward to an incredible evening together. And it is my pleasure to turn the microphone over to Rebecca Starr from the Hartman Institute.
Well, it's really an honor and a pleasure to be here in person, as Rabbi Hornsten said. So just thank you all for coming out on the dark, cold night of Michigan. I am Rebecca Starr. It's really an honor to welcome you on behalf of the Hartman Institute here tonight. As the Director of Regional Programs for the Institute, I have the honor and the real privilege of watching the ideas and scholarship that come out of the Institute find their way to leaders and learners from across North America. But there really is no community quite as special as Michigan. and Detroit and Ann Arbor and Grand Rapids, but maybe don't tell anybody else at the Institute that I said that. So really, again, thank you for coming tonight from all across the Metro Detroit area. And I know I saw some people from Ann Arbor and Grand Rapids. You're here with open minds, curiosity, and a commitment to dialogue and conversation. So I'm really particularly excited to note tonight that we share this space with multiple generations of our community. The teens that are here from Temple Israel, the Frankel Jewish Academy, Hillel Day School, and other parts of our community, they are the future. They're the leaders of the next generation. Their thoughts and ideas will help shape the way in which this great project of preserving and growing a commitment to Jewish peoplehood will emerge. Teens, college students, young adults sitting next to and learning with their teachers, their rabbis, their parents, their grandparents is truly the model, and it's beautiful to see it here tonight. And I'm really especially excited to note that some of our young teens are going to participate and be part of the program tonight. So this moment in time is truly complex. It seems to be changing and evolving more quickly than ever. The issues, the challenges in the world, our country, our community are facing, it's on our minds endlessly. The news cycle is endless. We know that we need ideas from thought leaders to help us process these moments and to push us to think deeply and critically. And the Hartman Institute is committed to that project. And we're really grateful to you for being part of that important work. So I want to make sure you know of a couple of things that we do, and also note that I'm always here in the Detroit area, except when I'm traveling to some of our other regions, so you should reach out to me. But note a couple of things. First, we have a couple of amazing podcasts. Identity Crisis, which is hosted by our North American president, Yehuda Kurtzer, and For Heaven's Sake, which you may have listened to because Yossi Klein Halevi is one of the personalities there, along with Danielle Hartman, president of the Hartman Institute, and Alana Stein-Hain, who is the director of our North American faculty. And today, I'm excited to tell you, if you don't know, we released a new podcast. It just came out today. You're going to check it out. It's called The Heretic in the House. So check out those great resources, and I know that you'll find the wisdom contained within really helpful and meaningful. So tonight is truly a community effort, which also adds to its unique nature. We're really grateful to our hosts, Temple Israel, and partnering organizations that include the Jewish Federation of Metro Detroit, the JCC and their SAGE and JLearn departments, and the JCRC and AJC. So before our teen leaders introduce Yossi Klein Halevi to you, I want to extend just a couple of extra moments of thanks to a few people that helped make this evening possible. First, my colleague, Natalie Debo, for her tireless efforts. She's from Chicago, she flew here, she's also in Denver helping us with programs there this whole week and last, so we're really grateful, and I'm grateful for her. And also to Toby Schlessel, who was helping check in tonight, for stepping in, to Yiftach Leket, who is our community shaliach. If you haven't met him yet, you should make sure that you do. Rabbi Asher Lopatin of the JCRC-AJC, Judy Lobel from the leadership team of the JCC, and really the entire staff of Temple Israel, with extra special thanks to Rabbi Marla Hornston, Rabbi Jen Lader, and Cantor Michael Smolash, and Alicia Goodman, who is also probably running around. There she is. Thank you, Alicia. And also final thanks to the William Davidson Foundation for having the vision to support the work of bringing Jewish ideas to the masses. So as Rabbi Harnston noted, you have note cards, so please think of your questions, and as the evening goes on, you can write them, and we'll make sure to collect them when the moment is right. And now it's my honor and pleasure to introduce Andrew Bertman and Sydney Butler as our team leaders who are going to introduce Yossi tonight.
Hi, my name is Sydney Butler.
And I'm Andrew Bertman, and we are the co-presidents of YIFTY, Temple Israel's youth group.
It is so meaningful for us to be here tonight to introduce our speaker, Yossi Klein Halevi. Both of us spent last summer on the team mission and experienced Israel for the first time. We've been hearing about it for our whole lives, but there's nothing quite like being there.
On our trip, we saw all the usual sights, prayed at the Western Wall, swam in the Dead Sea, and even hiked sea to sea. We met Israelis and talked one-on-one to get to just a better understanding of everyone and what it really means to live there, but not just what it is to be a tourist.
We understand there are a lot of issues in Israel, and the politics there are complicated, even more than in the U.S. So that's why we have Yossi here with us to talk about this most recent election and the future of Israel for all of us, but especially for our generation. Hopefully, he has all the answers we need today.
If you don't know about Yossi Klein Halevi, we'd like to share a few pieces of his biography. Yossi Klein Halevi is a senior fellow at the Shalom Hartman Institute in Jerusalem. Together with Imam Abdullah Antepli of Duke University and Maitel Friedman, he co-directs the Institute's Muslim Leadership Initiative. Yossi is the author of the New York Times bestseller, Letters to My Palestinian Neighbor, and all of the high school and college students here who are here tonight will receive a gift of his book. If you haven't gotten your copy already, please make sure to pick it up on your way out. He's also the co-host with Daniel Hartman and Alana Stein-Hain of the Institute's For Heaven's Sake podcast.
His bio goes on and on with the list of books he's written and awards he's received. Suffice it to say, we are impressed. Yossi was born in New York. He has a BA in Jewish Studies from Brooklyn College and an MS in Journalism from Northwestern University. He moved to Israel in 1982 and lives in Jerusalem with his wife, Sarah, who helps run a center for Jewish meditation. They have 3 children. Yossi, we are very happy to welcome you to Temple Israel tonight.
Thank you guys very much. And how about most of the answers? Really delighted to be back in the Detroit area, and especially to be in this extraordinary space. I have to admit, Rabbi Marla, that I'm intimidated to be standing in front of the tabernacle, and it must really be an effort to stand up here on Shabbat and speak before that. And it's extraordinary. I've never seen anything like this before, and it's amazing that no other synagogue ever thought of doing this. It's, you know, once you see it, it's so obvious and really, really inspiring. But what I would actually like to speak about tonight are a different set of symbols that are on the bima, and those are the 2 flags, the Israeli and the American flags. I'm working on a book about how the Jewish people overcame the Holocaust, how we went from the lowest point in our history to what I regard as the peak point in our history today, the most powerful expression of Jewish sovereignty that we've ever experienced, including in ancient times. What we experience today really dwarfs even the Davidic kingdom. And simultaneously, the emergence of the most self-confident and successful diaspora in Jewish history, the American Jewish community. And the story of how the Jewish people overcame the Holocaust is really represented by those 2 flags. And in a way, if you think about it, there's something strange about bringing these 2 ostensibly secular symbols onto the most sacred space of the synagogue. And yet, when American Jews in the 1940s and 50s decided in synagogues across the country to place these flags on the bima, they were intuiting the spiritual meaning of these symbols, that these were the flags that really represented our ability to push back against the abyss, and not only to survive the Holocaust, but I would argue that in a much deeper way to reverse it, to transform that lowest point to our greatest historical achievements. And so these 2 flags really have a kind of sanctity, which is what American Jews, I believe, of the earlier generations were telling us, that these flags represent the ability of the Jewish people to approximate the eternity of the divine through the eternity of the Jewish people. The values, the moral values, or the identities that these 2 flags were together expressing were an idea of Israel as simultaneously a Jewish state and a democratic state. Take away one or the other of these two flags, and the relationship between the American Jewish community and Israel begins to unravel. This is the foundation, the embrace of Israel as simultaneously a Jewish and a democratic state. What we see happening in recent years are the first signs of the unraveling or the fraying of this relationship on both sides. In Israel, we're seeing growing numbers of young Jews asking, is the democratic identity of Israel really necessary? Or is it an impediment to Israel protecting itself in one of the most dangerous regions on the planet? Do we really need the democratic norms, the democratic niceties? And shouldn't we just be using our power in an unrestricted way? And in parts of the American Jewish community, still on the fringes, but nevertheless growing, we're seeing young American Jews raising the question about the legitimacy of Israel as a Jewish state. Isn't there something anti-democratic about Israel giving effectively preferential treatment to the Jewish people? And so the two flags, which we've taken for granted, the entwinement of these two flags, which always seemed to most of us as a given, is suddenly not self-evident anymore. And what we really are defending, what we are called upon to defend, is the sacred entwinement of Jewish and democratic. And that's what I'd like to really focus on tonight. This election raised two fundamental questions. Aside from being a referendum on whether Netanyahu is worthy of being the prime minister of the Jewish state, there were two deeper issues that really emerged, especially in this round number 5 of this astonishingly bewildering period over the last few years. And one debate is over the nature of Israel as a Jewish state. What do we mean by Israel as a Jewish state? And the other is, what do we mean by Israel as a democratic state? Because it turns out that what many of us assumed was self-evident is in fact not so self-evident after all. Each camp, the liberal camp and the religious nationalist camp, the Netanyahu camp, each believes that they're defending a core identity of Israel against the other camp. On the right, they're warning that Israel's Jewishness is endangered by the liberal camp. They are defending the Jewish state. And in the liberal camp, they see themselves as defending the democratic nature of the state, and they argue, and this is my camp, and I would argue, that in fact the Jewish identity of the state is not open to question because there's virtually a wall-to-wall consensus among Jewish Israelis that Israel is a Jewish state. Now, each camp would insist that it is upholding an authentic version of Israel as a Jewish and democratic state. Neither camp would concede that it is upholding only one identity. And so what we need to do is really clarify, what do we mean by a Jewish state? What does each camp mean by a Jewish state? What does each camp mean by a democratic state? And how do these conflicting identities or definitions of Israel's two identities, how will this impact on the American Jewish community and on the American Jewish-Israeli relationship? Because we are at one of those crossroads in the relationship, and it requires our understanding what is being played out. The debate over a Jewish state between the liberal camp and the nationalist religious camp is effectively the following. Is Israel the state of the Jewish people, which is the liberal camp's definition? Or is it also the state of Judaism, which is the religious and nationalist definition? Israel is the state of the Jewish people, but also the state of Judaism. My understanding of Zionism is that it is the ideology of Jewish peoplehood. That the argument of Zionism is that the ground, the shared ground that determines our identification, our identity as a people, is not a shared sense of religious observance and belief, which it was for 2,000 years. For 2,000 years, you could travel the diaspora in almost any direction, from Yemen to Poland, and feel reasonably at home as a Jew, because there were a shared set of rituals, of beliefs. And this was an extraordinary experience. This was an extraordinary achievement. And in that sense, Judaism, and a very specific idea of Judaism, what we would call today Orthodox Judaism, in those years it was just known as Judaism, that defined who we were as a people. But something changed over the last 200 years. We are no longer quite the same people that we were before the beginning of modernity. A combination of Western influence, of the Holocaust, of 70 years of Soviet communism, of secular Zionism, all of these forces that converged and transformed us as a people. So Zionism's answer to what unites us in modernity is that it can't be religion, because religion, in fact, is what divides us in modernity. And so if we're looking for a common denominator, it needs to be something other than what united us for 2,000 years. And in that sense, Zionism was a revolution, and it makes sense that the ultra-Orthodox community bitterly opposed Zionism. From their perspective, they were right to oppose Zionism, because Zionism was a departure from 2,000 years of how Jews lived. But the compelling Zionist response to that was Jewish life has so fundamentally changed that we need new tools, new conceptual tools. And so Zionism offered us a new framework. Jewish peoplehood was always, obviously, a part of our identity, but now peoplehood moved to the fore and took the place of Judaism. The secular leaders of Zionism dared to arrogate for themselves the role that had been held by Orthodox rabbis for 2,000 years. And that was a necessary revolution, which, to one extent or another, most of the Jewish people came to accept, especially after the Holocaust. Today, the conflict in Israel over a Jewish state is precisely over this extraordinary achievement of Zionism in transforming what is the ground that unites most Jews, this shared sense of peoplehood. And what the religious and nationalist camp is trying to do, effectively, is set back the clock 200 years and have Israel, which was the expression of the Jewish people's most successful encounter with modernity, to instead become a repudiation of modernity. And when I speak about Zionism as being the ideology of Jewish peoplehood, what I'm really saying is that the old idea of Zionism, if you would have asked Jews, certainly in the pre-state era, what is the purpose of Zionism? What is the ideology of Zionism? Zionism is the ideology of Jewish statehood, that the Jewish people has the right to a homeland in its ancestral land. I now take that as a given. 75 years after the creation of the state, Zionism either needs a more compelling definition of itself, a more compelling ideology, or it's time to retire Zionism and say, okay, it succeeded. Now let's move on. I believe that in insisting on the definition of peoplehood as the binding commonality for Jewish life in modernity, Zionism continues to have an urgent message for the Jewish people, and never more so than today when that message is under attack in Israel. Zionism promised the Jewish people that it would create a public space in a sovereign Jewish state that would reflect the totality of the Jewish people, so that every faction, political, religious, every faction of the Jewish people would find some reflection of itself in this national identity, in the public sphere. And that meant that no one ideology, no one stream of Judaism could monopolize public space in a Jewish state. That is an anti-Zionist move. And so by giving the keys to official Judaism in the state of Israel to one denomination, and not just the Orthodox, but increasingly the ultra-Orthodox, who are dominating the religious establishment, that part of the Jewish people that feels the least sense of responsibility for the totality of the Jewish people, that, to my mind, is a profoundly anti-Zionist act. And I would add parenthetically that when the reform and conservative movements speak to the Israeli people, use that language. Use the language of Zionism. Don't speak about religious pluralism. Israelis don't know what religious pluralism is. It's not part of their cultural family baggage. Most Israeli Jews come either from the Middle East or from Eastern Europe. There was no Jewish religious pluralism in most of those communities. But speak to Israelis about Zionism, about Jewish peoplehood, and that argument can resonate. That's the fight that we are about to enter into in Israel, and that's the fight that I believe the diaspora needs to join as well. And so the debate really that's shaping up in Israel is how central is religion to be for a Jewish state. The Sephardic chief rabbi, Yaakov Yosef, recently made a statement just the other day that Israel is an Orthodox country. My response to that is yes, it is, but it's also a secular country. It's also a traditionalist country that is neither secular nor Orthodox. It's also Jewish, it's also Arab. Israel is many things. And to try to narrow the definition of Israel to one part of the Jewish people is to violate the most basic promise of Zionism. In the early years of the state, the secular labor, the secular socialist Zionist movement attempted to do exactly that. It claimed to embody the ideal Israeli. The ideal Israeli was secular, socialist, not coincidentally Ashkenazi, and we are still paying the price in Israeli society for that attempt to impose a narrow definition on Israeliness. We are, I'm afraid, about to experience the same move, but from the opposite direction. And so that is really what we need to be watching very carefully. I would define a Jewish state as being composed of three essential elements. The first is the law of return. That, to my mind, is the seminal definition, legal definition, of Israel as a Jewish state, which is that Israel arrogates for itself the right to discriminate in favor of Jews when it determines who is eligible for immigration into the Jewish state. The former Chief Justice of the Israeli Supreme Court, Aaron Barak, who really helped define Israeli jurisprudence in its most liberal form, vigorously defended the democratic legitimacy of the law of return, of Israel's right to discriminate in favor of Jews for immigration, by noting that every country assumes for itself the right to discriminate about who may enter and who may not. That's a fundamental expression of national sovereignty. So Israel is permitted, according to the norms of democracy, to discriminate, to determine who it wants coming into the country. But once an immigrant enters the country, they are not eligible for any favorable treatment over other citizens, over non-Jewish citizens. That was Aaron Barak's definition. So, number one, the law of return. Number two, the creation of a public space that is largely shaped and defined by Jewish culture, Jewish civilization, Jewish values, concerns. Hebrew is the language, the calendar is the Jewish year cycle. Now, that is not an exclusively Jewish public space, but the majority has the right to determine the cultural identity of how the public space is expressed. And finally, the third essential component in defining Israel as a Jewish state is that Israel will maintain deep and ongoing relations with Jewish communities around the world. And what happens in the diaspora is of keen interest to the Israeli government. Now, to my mind, these three fundamentals of a Jewish state are compatible with Israel as a democracy. It's not an easy fit, but one can make that case. Now, what do we mean really by a democratic state? And here again, we are seeing the emergence of two very different ideas of Israel as a democratic state. For the right, the religious and nationalist right, democracy is the rule of the majority. Simple majority rule. Netanyahu just said it again today. He made a statement saying we will try, of course, to accommodate as wide a perspective as possible in our decision-making. Don't believe it. But we are, in the end, committed to the democratic principle of a simple majority. Majority rules. And according to this definition of democracy, majority takes all. The liberal camp's counter-argument about what constitutes a democratic state is a delicate balancing act between the rights of the majority and the protected rights of a minority. If you're operating only on the basis of a simple majority rule, then there is no protection for the majority, for the minority. One of the goals of the Netanyahu coalition, and this is something I think we're going to see happening almost immediately with the formation of the government, is a bill to override the jurisdiction of the Supreme Court with a simple parliamentary majority, which means that 61 Knesset members out of 120 can effectively override any Supreme Court decision. The Supreme Court is the basis for protecting minority rights. And by minority rights, I first of all mean the Arab minority in Israel, but not only, because my camp is now a minority. And I need some sense that my Israel is not going to be entirely erased in the next 4 years. But if this override bill passes, there will be very little break, very little B-R-A-K-E, to stop the dictatorship of a simple majority. The other issue over democracy that divides the two factions is whether democracy is a technical means of government, simply the way that determines how we vote every 4 years, or as the case may be, every 4 months, or whether democracy is part of the Israeli ethos, whether it is an expression of the basic values, along with a Jewish state, a democratic state defines what it means to be a modern Jewish state. Is democracy integral to the Israeli ethos, or is it an appendage? And so, as we debate the meaning of Jewish state and democratic state, Israel at 75 clearly doesn't yet know what it is, what it will be when it grows up. And we are experiencing, I would argue, the most profound identity crisis in the country's history. That's what this incoming government represents. Now, this election threatens the stability of Israeli democracy in two ways. First of all, as I've laid out, the intended assault on our democratic institutions, especially the courts, and also an assault on the democratic ethos. And the threat to the democratic ethos is coming from a very specific source, which is the rise of the far right, the far nationalist right, represented by Itamar Ben-Gvir and Bezalel Smotrich. And they are reflecting a growing anti-democratic mood among certain segments of the population. Now, in one sense, you know, I've been doing a fair number of media interviews in this period of elections with the foreign press. And they're all saying, you know, the question is, why is the far right, why has the Israeli far right risen now? And my pushback is, the better question would be, what took so long for the far right to take root in Israel? And the reason that I say that is that if you look around the world, look at Western Europe, look at the United States, you'll see that democracies are increasingly vulnerable to far right, to the simplistic answers of the far right nationalists. In Europe, France, Germany, Sweden, we're seeing an extraordinary rise in the far right. 41% of French voters supported Marine Le Pen. Extraordinary. In Sweden, the second largest party was an openly neo-Nazi party until the 1980s. And so this is a pattern that we're seeing all over the West. And much of the rise of the far right in Europe is a response to some very dramatic terror attacks that happened in Paris and Berlin, elsewhere. And yet, when you think about what Israelis live with on a daily basis, what we have lived with for 75 years, it is truly extraordinary that our political system has largely been immune to this kind of poisonous politics. But that immunity is over. And so we need to understand why this is happening and how we confront this. Now, the Israeli public is not turning fascist. That's not what's happened in this election. I believe that Ben-Gvir and his party is fascist, but most Israelis who voted for that party did so for security reasons, for deep and legitimate fear. The main trigger for the rise, the immediate trigger for the rise of the far right, were the riots last year in Israel's mixed cities, the worst violence that we've had between Arab Israelis and Jewish Israelis. I'm not speaking about the West Bank now. Speaking about Israel proper. There were bands of young Arab men who were seeking to lynch Jews in the streets, burning synagogues, and then counter mobs of Jews that were formed seeking to lynch Arabs. It was the worst intercommunal violence that we've experienced since 1948. And that created a deep sense of fear, personal fear, among many Israelis. And what Ben-Gvir managed to do very successfully was convince Israelis that he's a new man. He's moderated. He's really broken with the Kahanist ideology, the ideology of the extremist Rabbi Meir Kahane, who was his rabbi and mentor. And he's now a normative, certainly hard right leader, but really still within the right-wing legitimate discourse of Israeli politics. What I believe Ben-Gvir is really seeking to do is create a new category of Israeli citizen, the conditional Israeli citizen. And he is seeking to place Israel's Arab population, the 20% of Israel that are citizens of Israel, in this new category of citizenship on condition. You need to prove your loyalty, and who will determine loyalty, that's a separate question. And if you are disloyal to the state of Israel, your place is not in an Israeli jail, but expulsion outside the country, so that every Arab Israeli will be living under the shadow of potential expulsion. Ben-Gvir recently gave a speech at a memorial for Rabbi Meir Kahane, where he said, "I no longer support the expulsion of all Arabs." And this was seen in much of the Israeli media as a step forward. You see, Ben-Gvir really is moderating. But pay attention to that crucial, what's the crucial word there? All. And what he's doing is very subtly, but with great determination, re-educating the Israeli public and changing the discourse. Suddenly, we're all talking about which Arabs should be expelled? Should any Arabs be expelled? Maybe some should be. That's how a democracy begins to undermine itself. When you start changing the norms, the language, you're beginning the process of corrosion. And this is what is so insidious about the rise of Ben-Gvir. Now, I grew up on the Jewish right, the Jewish nationalist right. When I was a teenager, I was a member of the Beitar youth movement, the youth movement of Jabotinsky, Menachem Begin. And we had a song that we used to sing in Beitar, a song that some of you may have heard of, "Both Sides of the Jordan River." Both sides, both banks of the Jordan belong to us, the west side and the east side. And this was quite an expansionist and radical song, radical vision of Israel's borders, not just the West Bank, but including what is the Kingdom of Jordan. But in that nationalist, hard right hymn was a line about how the future Jewish state will provide prosperity and freedom for, quote, I'll try to do this in English, the son of Arabia, the son of Nazareth, the Christian, and my son. The son of Arabia, the son of Nazareth, and my son. In other words, Muslims, Christians, and Jews. All would be equal in this grand, expanded Jewish state that Jabotinsky imagined in the 1920s and 30s. And so that was once a normative part of the Zionist right, which means that democracy was a given for left, right, center. All factions of the Zionist movement were Zionist, were democratic. That was a given. It's no longer a given in 2022 Israel. There's a lot of material here, and I've promised to keep this to around 50 minutes, so we'll see how I do. The election was really a contest between two competing visions for Arab-Jewish relations in the state of Israel. On the one hand, there was the dark vision of the Lud riots, the dark vision of Ben Gvir, this idea of the Arab Israelis as a violent fifth column or a potential fifth column. And on the other hand, there was the vision that was laid out in this outgoing coalition, which was the first government in Israel's history to bring together Jewish parties and an Arab party. And what made that so extraordinary was that the first Arab party to break the taboo of an Arab party being willing to sit in a Zionist government was an Islamist party, which just gives you an idea of how counterintuitive Israel is. No one could have imagined that the first Arab party that would say, we agreed to sit in a Zionist government, would be a party that most of us assumed was the most radical. And yet Mansour Abbas, the head of this party, had the vision to see that this was an opportunity because the Jewish parties were deadlocked after 4 elections. And he realized that only an Arab party could break that deadlock and help the Jewish parties of one camp or another form a government. And so he did. And Mansour Abbas made history by declaring that Israel was founded as a Jewish state and it will remain a Jewish state. He was the first mainstream Arab Israeli politician in the history of the state to accept Israel as a Jewish state. At the same time, he challenged the Jewish majority to own Israel's identity as a democratic state and provide real place in the Israeli mainstream for the Arab minority. Now think about that trade-off. What Mansour Abbas was really saying was, we, the Arab minority, need finally, after 75 years, come to terms with Israel as a Jewish state and stop trying to resist Israel as a Jewish state. At the same time, we need to challenge the Jewish majority to do better and to own the Israeli identity as a democratic state and treat us as full citizens. So these were the two competing visions of relations between Arabs and Jews, and for now it seems that the dark vision is prevailing. Zionism effectively took responsibility for two peoples. On the one hand, it recreated the Jewish people. It brought millions of Jews back to our homeland, living in intimate proximity with each other, recreating us as once again, one people. And at the same time, Zionism created a new people called the Israelis. Now, there's certainly a great deal of overlap between these two peoples, but they're not entirely identical. We know not every Jew is an Israeli, and not every Israeli is a Jew. 20% of Israel's population is Arab. We go through periodically coalition crises in Israel over the question, who is a Jew? How do you define who is eligible as a Jew for citizenship in Israel? I think a much more important question is, who is an Israeli? And how do we begin to define what unites us as an Israeli people? I believe that the Arab minority has a responsibility to accept the right of the Jewish majority to define the state as a Jewish state. But the Jewish majority has the responsibility to own the identity of Israel as a democratic state and truly make place for the Arab minority. And in that sense, to create what we could call the Mansour Abbas dynamic, which is we make place at the table for Arab parties, and the reciprocal gesture is the acceptance of Israel as a Jewish state. My understanding of Israeli democracy is that it is a kind of miracle. Israel is a laboratory for democracy under conditions of extremity. There is no democracy anywhere that has been more sorely tested for so long as Israel's democracy. Israel was born in war. It has never known a moment of real peace. There's no other democracy that has experienced quite that level of sustained pressure and threat. And then if you factor in waves of refugees coming into Israeli society, almost all of them from non-democratic societies, coming into the Israeli pressure cooker, it truly is an extraordinary story and how Israeli democracy has not only survived, but in many ways grown and thrived. And even the failures of Israeli democracy are important because they're instructive. They teach us what are the fault lines in a democracy when you apply enough pressure against a democratic society. So the cracks in Israeli democracy, to my mind, are no less worthy of note than the successes. But I mentioned a moment ago that Israeli democracy is a miracle. And I say that with a mixture of pride and anxiety, because a miracle is a defiance of the laws of nature. A miracle is not something that can be taken for granted. A miracle has to be nurtured. And what we see with the government coming in is a deep suspicion and even hostility to basic democratic norms. And I worry about the durability of Israeli democracy when we are being assaulted, not only from our borders, where we're surrounded by terror enclaves, with Iran hovering on almost every border, but now Israeli democracy will have empowered some of its greatest enemies from within, and I'm thinking specifically of the far right. The glory of Israel is not to be a paragon of democratic virtues. We're not. There are other democracies that are more democratic than Israel is. But there's no other democracy that has to balance the kinds of pressures that we routinely deal with between security, democratic norms, morality, than Israel. And so the glory of Israel is in its struggle in the midst of near impossible pressure for trying to maintain basic democratic norms, basic decency. Sometimes we succeed, sometimes we don't. But it's the struggle in that context that is the glory of the state of Israel. And context is really the essence of Jewish thinking. The Talmud is one long argument over context. There are a set of religious laws which the rabbis then apply to any imaginable circumstance in daily lives, even absurd circumstances. But that's the exercise of the Talmud, is playing out context, the impact of context on the law. And if you factor in the context with which Israel lives, this relentless sense of threat, then you really begin to appreciate that struggle that defines Israeli democracy. And so when we look to see whether Israel is a paragon of democratic norms, we miss the point. So long as Israel is continuing to struggle to be a paragon, that is the value of Israeli democracy. What worries me is that we have enemies from without, the anti-Zionists, who despise that struggle and dismiss it as irrelevant. That struggle for them is a distraction from Israel's moral violations. And we have the ultra-Zionists within Israel who also despise that struggle. who see the struggle for democratic norms as a distraction, as something that weakens us. I believe that that's the source of our strength. And so, my last point for you really is, where does this leave us? Where does this leave American Jewry? The first point is that we do not turn the other camp into deplorables, to coin a phrase. We don't import the language of delegitimization and demonization, which is frankly poisoning American political discourse. Israel is too small a place. The margin for error is too narrow. We can't afford to start that kind of mutual delegitimization. And so we have a very difficult struggle ahead in the coming few years, but it has to be fought without that poisonous politics. The second point is that we need an alliance of the American Jewish mainstream, the Zionist liberal American Jewish mainstream, with the liberal center of Israeli politics. Now, in the American Jewish understanding, I think that there's a certain time warp that many American Jews are still in terms of Israel, which is seeing Israeli politics as a competition between left and right. That's an old model of Israel. We once were that in the 80s, 90s. We no longer are. There's virtually no left. It's gone. Labor Party, the party that founded the state of Israel, is now the smallest party in the incoming Knesset. 4 seats out of 120. Meretz, the party to its left, is gone. And so American Jews, American Jewish liberals who are looking for allies in the Israeli political system need to start looking in the center. I'm thinking of Yair Lapid's party, of Benny Gantz's party. This is the opposition to the nationalist and religious right. It's coming from the center, which is more moderate than the left, closer to the very much part of the Israeli mainstream, and that's the camp that American Jews need to begin a relationship with and to see as your home in the Israeli political system. And what we need is really a relationship between Jewish grown-ups. And by that I mean that American Jews need to stop asking, should we get involved? Do we criticize? And to realize that this is one of those moments where we're fighting for the Israel that's on the bima. And an Israel that can make the Jewish people around the world proud. Maybe the last point, there's always a last point, is what gives me hope. I'm personally observing the 40th anniversary of my immigration to Israel. My wife and I moved to Israel in the summer of 1982. And I'm mentioning that because the summer of 1982 was one of the worst periods in Israel's history. It was the period of what we now call the First Lebanon War. It was the beginning of the Lebanon War. It was the first and only time that Israeli society was divided against itself during war and over war. War always united Israel. 1982, Israelis were deeply divided about the justness of that war. It never happened before, and fortunately, it's never happened since. It was also an Israel that was experiencing 500% inflation. Inconceivable today in startup nation. It was also an Israel that was so deeply riven between Ashkenazim and Mizrahim, Jews from European origin, Jews from Middle Eastern origin, that Israelis were frankly speaking about a coming ethnic civil war. And finally, there was almost no aliyah, almost no immigration. When Sarah and I showed up at the airport, we had to wait for hours before someone from the Jewish agency showed up, because they were just kind of surprised that there were immigrants, never mind from America, immigrants from anywhere. And that was 1982. And what I've learned in the 40 years of living in Israel is never freeze the frame and say, this is Israel, and this is what Israel is going to be. I have lived through at least 4 distinct versions of Israel since moving there. 4 almost different countries. That was really the radical shift from one Israel to the other. Israel is one of the most fluid and dynamic societies that I know. And so, as difficult as this moment is, and being Jewish grown-ups together means that we face the severity of this time. It's not only on me and my fellow liberal Israelis to face the consequences of this moment. This is a moment for the whole Jewish people to reckon with. But at the same time, it's also crucial to remember that whatever is now will not be. Maybe it'll be worse, maybe it'll be better. It will not stay the same. That's not how Israel works. And the changes in Israel happen very, very quickly. And so I believe that we still have the capacity to grow, to learn from our mistakes, to pull back from the abyss as we have repeatedly. And when I think about the issues that seemed so overwhelming in the summer of 1982, all of those issues have disappeared or been severely lessened. They've been replaced by other existential threats. But those issues have been resolved. And so we have the capacity to deal with whatever we're confronting, and we're going to need to do this one way or another together. So thank you all very much.
Okay, Andrew and Sydney are going to ask some questions, but if you have some in your hands that you wrote on your cards, you can just raise them up, and there's a couple of us that will come around and grab your cards.
Hello, hello. Okay, there we go. Sorry, I didn't know if it was on. Okay, so we have some questions coming around, but we have some to start off with. So the first question we have for you tonight was, after listening to you tonight, it makes us a little scared for Israel. So as teens, what do you think we should do with this information?
One of the ideas that I'm promoting on this lecture tour is to try to get mainstream Jewish organizations, philanthropies, communities connected with the Israeli Center, with these parties. And I'm not doing it as a party person, I'm not, but as an alliance, a conversation that needs, first of all, a conversation that needs to happen. And I would like to see Israeli politicians coming to American Jewish communities and starting to engage with American Jews, but in a different way than they have in the past. Usually Israeli politicians come and try to create support and rev people up, and I think we really need some deep conversations. And so what I'm trying to encourage is that, and I think that what each of you can do is become more knowledgeable about Israel. Read an Israeli news site. Read the Times of Israel, which I think is the best English language news site. Read it every day. Let it be part of your practice. I would also urge American Jews to start learning Hebrew. I think that we really need to start deepening the conversation between us. And really what I'm saying is that as American Jews start dealing with Israel's problems, you also need to be benefiting from the richness of Israeli culture. And it can't only be a political conversation anymore. American Jews support Israel. Yes, American Jews, I believe, have to continue supporting Israel. But that's not enough. We need engagement in Israel's problems, and we need American Jews to participate in some way in the extraordinary culture that we're creating in Israel. And I want to see a reciprocal relationship. I want to see Israeli Jews learning about the different forms of American Judaism. I want Israeli Jews to understand what religious pluralism actually means and how it plays out in an open society. So I'm really advocating the beginnings. And I know this is a long, long process, but I don't have quick answers. I think we need to start thinking of a deeper mutual engagement.
All right, so you use the term discriminate in favor of Jews for immigration. So the question is, isn't that a negative term? Wouldn't many view it as in that negative way? And does it give Israel a bad name?
It's a really interesting question. I use that word deliberately, provocatively, because there, I think, are forms of discrimination that are not negative. If you think of what used to be called reverse discrimination, affirmative action, an earlier name for that was reverse discrimination, and affirmative action is effectively reverse discrimination. And I think there are times in the life of a nation when you need to have affirmative action. And my understanding of the law of return is an expression of exactly that. The Jewish people needed affirmative action in terms of establishing a safe refuge, and I don't think we have to apologize for that.
Okay, sounds good. So you used the term moved on from Zionism, and the question was, what would happen if we did move on from Zionism?
Well, I don't think anything would happen. I was really, I was raising the possibility of seeing Zionism as a success story, and we have the state of Israel. And you know, when I think of my kids, I'm not sure that they really even think of themselves as Zionists. They love Israel, they're Israeli patriots. And so there is that line of thinking that we don't need Zionism anymore. But I think we do need Zionism as the uniting framework for Israel and the diaspora. Zionism is what defines us as a people. And that's why I'm looking at a 21st century definition of Zionism, which is not about statehood, because statehood is a given. We won. But let's look at the other aspect of Zionist ideology, which is defining the nature of Jewish identity. That's a very radical thing, again, that Zionism did. And that's what I feel we need to embrace, is that radical identity of Zionism, defining Jewish identity as peoplehood.
So you mentioned the recent election in Israel and the importance of it. And this question is revolved around the importance of the young people who were involved in this election. So how do young people vote in Israel, and how did they show up in this most recent election?
Yeah, well, the dynamic in Israel is in a way the opposite of what's happening here. Here, the younger you go, the more left you'll find. In Israel, the younger you go, the more right. And there are good reasons for that, one of which is the ongoing terrorism, the failure of the peace process, which really broke down in the year 2000 and ended in 4 years of the worst terrorism in Israel's history. And that's had a lingering impact on the generations that have come after the collapse of the peace process. And there's also the impact of the army. You know, when young people serve in the territories, and they experienced the hatred of many Palestinians toward Israel. That also has a radicalizing impact. My generation was the generation of what we call the first Intifada, which was of the 1980s and early 90s. And for many of us who served in the army then, it had the opposite impact. What we experienced was the corrupting influence of ruling over another people and of the need to try to end that situation. And that was my conclusion coming out of my military service. But something has changed. The circumstances have changed. And Israelis are responding in a way that I understand. I understand why there is that anger and despair, which is really what is fueling the right-wing vote.
Okay. I'm gonna butcher his name, but is Netanyahu concerned about his legacy?
That's really an interesting question. I once would have said that's all he's concerned about. Today, I would say that all he's concerned about is stopping the corruption trial. And to that end, he is willing to do almost anything, including moves that he himself once defined as beyond the pale. For example, 2 years ago, he was asked whether Itamar Ben-Gvir, the leader of the far right, would be a minister in his government. And he said, Itamar Ben-Gvir is not fit to be a minister in the state of Israel. Today, he is about to appoint him the Minister of Police, Minister of Internal Security. And that's extraordinary. Netanyahu, in the past, defined the situation in which large numbers of ultra-Orthodox yeshiva students are exempt from the workforce as an existential long-term threat to the Israeli economy. Today's Netanyahu has agreed to double the salary, the stipend that each yeshiva student is getting, and to extend their exemption from the workforce. And so Netanyahu today is undermining his own legacy, is effectively destroying his legacy because he's so desperate to create a coalition that will extricate him from his trial.
Okay, so a follow-up question is, would that play a role in what government and ministries he would be willing to let the far-right partner have?
Well, he's not letting them have the defense ministry. I suppose we could say, thank God for very small favors. But he is apparently giving Ben-Gvir's partner, Bezalel Smotrich, the finance ministry, which will allow him to funnel large amounts of funding to the settlement expansion. And so we're really seeing the mainstreaming of a political force which was really inconceivable even 2 years ago. And that's what's so worrying today.
All right, the next question we got here is, how does the Israeli political parties differ on how they would handle the threat of Iran and their nuclear weapons development?
My sense is that most Israeli parties agree that a nuclear Iran is inconceivable and that Israel will do everything it can to stop a nuclear Iran. And frankly, I don't see any other way to stop it anymore than an Israeli strike. I mean, there would be the possibility of stopping it through an American strike, but that's not going to happen. And so I fear it's going to be up to Israel to do, and the consequences for Israel will be severe. There are something like 150,000 to 200,000 missiles and rockets pointed at every part of Israel from neighboring countries and Iran. And we are likely going to experience, as a result of an Israeli strike on Iran, the worst attack against the Israeli home front in our history. And that's something that I believe the Army is preparing for. And when it comes to Iran, I am very hawkish. I think that this really is an existential issue. And I sense, again, that most of the political system, in the end, will probably unite around a last-minute attempt to prevent a nuclear Iran.
All right, and one last question, basically summarizing everything you've talked about tonight. So how do you envision the future of Israel?
You know, it's a great question, and I have no answer for that. Israelis and Americans we have lots of differences in mentality, but one of the main differences is how we relate to the future. And, you know, I'll get these emails from family or friends in America, hold this date. And it's usually for an event, a wedding, a bar bat mitzvah, 9 months ahead. And I look at that, I say, what am I supposed to do with that? How do I know what's going to happen 9 months from now? Maybe there'll be a war. Maybe there'll be some economic crisis. It's inconceivable. Israelis always have in their minds the possibility of upheaval. That's built into the Israeli psyche. We don't take the future for granted. The name of the leading centrist party, Yair Lapid's party, is Yesh Atid. There is a future. In case you had any doubt, there is a future. Now, I don't know of any other political system that has a party with a name like that. There is a future. Oh, that's a relief, you know, because I wasn't sure. And so our relationship to time is very different. And I don't know. I can't conceive of Israel 5 years from now. Honestly, I can't conceive of Israel a year from now. What is Israel going to look like a year after this government of ultras, ultra-nationalists, ultra-Orthodox? How deeply will they manage to remake Israel in the next year? So if you're asking me about the Israel that I want to see, I can answer that question. But I can't imagine the future. The Israel that I want to see is an Israel that is an expression of all of its pieces. The nature of Israel, Israeli society, is a society that was created by what we call the ingathering of the exiles, the bringing together of Jews from all parts of the world. And when you create a society that's, as you know, in America, but in Israel it's more dramatic because it's smaller and more contained. When you bring people from all over the world, you are creating a kind of a microcosm of humanity. And that's really what we have in Israel. We have a microcosm of humanity in Jewish form. And then you factor in the Arab minority to just complicate things even more. And so the very nature of Israeli society requires a certain expansiveness, requires a realization that no one camp can determine this is Israeli identity. This is what Israel is supposed to be. And it has to be an outgrowth, an organic outgrowth of these competing visions of Israel. And my vision of Israel is the sum total of our competing visions, which is why when I said earlier that yes, Israel is Orthodox, but it's also secular, it's also many things. That is my vision of Israel. And that's the Israel that we need to fight for, and that's the Israel that I'm here trying to represent. Thank you all very much. And thank you guys. It was great.
Thank you so much. I'm Natalie. For those of you I haven't had the opportunity to meet yet, I'm the Midwest Program Coordinator for the Shalom Hartman Institute. And I want to thank everybody for joining for this very important evening. We are really delighted by the opportunity to be able to bring conversations like this one to the Detroit Jewish community. Thank you, Yossi, for offering us frameworks to better understand what is happening in Israel as we continue to think about how to engage with these issues thoughtfully. Outside of the sanctuary, we are hosting an informal reception with coffee and fruit, as well as some dessert, and we hope you'll join us for that. We also have some books, so if you are a teen or a student, college student, teen, feel free to grab one. We'll also have a book signing outside, so we hope you'll stick around. If you didn't grab letters from my Palestinian neighbor already. And you can find those outside. We also hope you'll revisit the pamphlet that you received on the way in. There's a bunch of different things happening, not just here on the local level, but also on the national level that you can engage with at home. And we also want to thank our partners, our incredible hosts at Temple Israel, in addition to AJC, JCC, including JLearn and the Seminars for Adult Jewish Enrichment, the Jewish Federation of Metropolitan Detroit. I want to thank our teens for this wonderful Q&A, Andrew and Sydney, and thank you to everyone else. Yes, amazing.
And on behalf of all the teens here, we just really wanted to say thank you. It was really knowledgeable and we got to learn a lot, and we're really thankful for opportunities like this, so thank you so much.
What a guy, what a night. Yossi Klein Halevi, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.